Welcome to Economic Inequality, an introduction in 3 short chapters. I'm Joshua Scove. I'm faculty at the University of Oregon. These are public domain teaching materials. Please be in touch if you have comments or suggestions. Part 1, Framing, Measures, and Definitions. The supporting materials named here can serve as complementary readings, and for more information, please visit my website. Let's walk through all of the various elements of this 3-part introduction. I start this section with a what is, what should be two-dimensional perspective space, and also look at some essential questions for business. I teach in a business school, but this material should be widely relevant in a variety of disciplines. Next, we'll look at a few specific measures of economic inequality. I'll really focus on the Gini coefficient, specifically 2 views of it, pre-distribution and redistribution views that I'll define. And then we'll also look briefly at executive compensation and the share of national income going to the top 1% in an economy. In a future module, we'll take a look at a variety of analyses, interpretations, and critiques of where we are and how we got here with respect to economic inequality. We'll go through a few of the perspectives out there. There are too many to cover in detail, but I hope to span the space and give a sense of the different flavors of critiques that exist. And finally, the third part, we'll take a look at a few different intersections with other inequalities. This intersectionality is quite rich, especially with race and gender, but we'll also dip into some examples that link economic inequality to the climate crisis and to COVID-19. So why this topic? Well, first of all, I really buy into Andrew Winston's notion of the big pivot, as he lays it out in his book by the same name. He says that business has to do this big pivot. We have to learn to solve humanity's biggest challenges profitably, and that has to be the core pursuit of business. I like that, and it certainly gives me all the excuse I need to use economic inequality as a topic in a business course. Economic inequality certainly appears to be one of those big challenges. I would also say, though, that business clearly has a role to play, and people expect it. The private sector has a lot of economic and political power, and as you, my students, become business leaders, I hope you'll learn to use that power responsibly. And there are even some mainstream businesses that are starting to agree with this. We need change. I think business definitely has a role to play here. Intellectually, this topic is challenging, and I'm finding a lot of students don't get an introduction to it anyplace else. So that's another excuse for me to offer it. My reasons for helping you wrestle with this are as follows. The ideology of capitalism really is the unspoken default setting of our society, and I think default ideologies really demand scrutiny. There's a famous joke about 2 fish swimming along. One fish says to the other, "How's the water?" The second fish says, "What's water?" Well, that often is the way we end up being able to talk about or not talk about capitalism and all of the pieces that come with it. So we may have values that actually conflict with or even suffer under the status quo: meritocracy, democracy, competition, fairness. And I think the more closely you look at capitalism, the more that scrutiny will expose that ideology that's in the water. I hope that this is a platform for you to use as a springboard to examine this more in the future. So let's take a look at this 2-dimensional space to understand different perspectives and different worldviews with respect to this topic. To be clear from the beginning, I'm not telling you what to think, and I'm not even necessarily telling you what I think. I'm just describing a way to characterize a particular mindset. I think it'll be helpful. On the next slide, we'll give concrete examples, but let's start now with the framework. The vertical axis is what should be in someone's view. And that could range from, at the top, more equality is better, and society should deliberately pursue it, to at the other end of the axis, inequality is okay, and perhaps inequality is just and appropriate. So that's a range of perspectives that would be captured there. I've given you some caricatures, perhaps, but you can imagine a spectrum. The horizontal axis is someone's view of what is. So with respect to inequality. So at one end of the spectrum, one could believe that we live in a highly unequal society with inequality of opportunity and inequality of outcomes. And at the other end, we could believe that we live in a very egalitarian society with maybe total equality of opportunity and outcomes. So any particular point on this space essentially describes a particular mindset about what is at the moment and what should be in society. So let's dig in with this framework. I'm going to place on it 4 mindsets that are represented by these different quadrants. Now keep in mind, these are caricatures. The important part is to have some sort of framework for understanding complexity. You might even find that your thoughts and your feelings about individual topics that I cover subsequently actually move around in this 2-dimensional space. That's fine. The goal here is just to give you something to use to wrestle with a topic that has a lot going on. So these 4 points, what are they? Let's take the top one. We live in a highly equal society, and that's how it should be. That makes sense, right? We live in an egalitarian society, and more equality is better. So that's number 1. Number 2, in the lower left, we live in a highly unequal society, and that's how it should be. Not a lot of tension in those 2 views. Let's take a look at number 3 and 4, and those get a little more interesting. So number 3, in the lower right, is consistent with believing that our society does too much to pursue equality. There are too many handouts, too much redistribution, and these interventions take from the deserving and give to the undeserving. We should accept natural inequality, quote unquote natural, as generated by markets and freedom and being correct and just. And then in the upper left-hand corner, the view here is that society is unjust and we should fix it, that we have inequality and that's something that's wrong. The economic system, perhaps the market, the state, our culture, a blend thereof, suppresses opportunity and generates persistent, unjust outcomes. That's the characterized view in the upper left-hand corner. So we have 4 different views involving what is and what should be. I want you to think about this 2-dimensional space as a way of understanding any particular perspective. Now, my goals here, let me be clear. First, both axes are subjective. Right? Both what is, what we perceive in the world around us, and what should be, what is normatively the appropriate goal for society, clearly open to interpretation and discussion. I also want to give some metrics subsequently here for what is. That's what we'll spend the rest of this part on. And also, I would say that I'm hoping to provide some interpretation of how we got to our current situation, and in some cases, what's wrong and how it should change. Perhaps tipping my hand a little bit. But that 3rd bullet point is really for future parts, not this one. Now, again, I am not telling you what to think about what should be. I want to be clear about that. That said, I think learning about what is might inform how you feel about what should be as you go through this material. All right, let's look at a few essential questions. I won't read the grayed out ones below. We'll take a look at those in parts 2 and 3. But in part 1 here, the real question is, what is the general shape of economic inequality today in the United States? And what specific measures can we use to assess the extent of economic inequality? We'll focus here mainly on the Gini coefficient, but we'll also dip into CEO pay and the share of national income going to the top 1%. Now, I say here I've focused on the United States because I live and work in the U.S., but I'll need to bring in some data from outside in order to provide a little more perspective as we go. Let's start with some terms and metrics as we lead toward considering the Gini coefficient in detail. Income inequality, wealth inequality, economic inequality generally. You've probably heard all these terms, but let's put a fine point on these. Income is what you make in a year. Wealth is what you accumulate over time. I'm not going to think about it much harder than that. Now, these 2 measures are clearly linked, but markets and policy probably affect them quite differently at different times. There are many specific measures out there that you use to get at these different points, but we're really just going to focus on the ones that I named. Now, the Gini coefficient is the most common measure of the concentration of income, and we'll be thinking about it through 2 filters, really in a pre-distribution and redistribution sense. More on that in a moment. And it is worth noting that global income and U.S. Income and the distributions thereof are really quite different. There's been different paths for the global economy versus individual national economies, and we'll touch on that in a little bit. I think it would be wrong not to mention that a key shift in recent decades has been poverty reduction in Asia, especially China. And we'll take a look at those graphs in a little bit. Certainly one of the biggest trends in economic inequality globally in the last generation. Finally, there are many other legitimate indicators of economic inequality and, of course, of inequality broadly. I'll touch on a couple in a minute, but again, most of that is going to be beyond the scope of this talk. So what is the Gini coefficient? Let's go over the basics. The definition is this: it's a measure between 0 and 1 of how far an economy's income or wealth distribution deviates from a totally equal distribution. So lower is more equal and higher is more unequal. And the caricatures of that are the endpoints. A Gini of 0 is when everyone has exactly the same income. And a Gini coefficient of 1 is when one person has all of the income. Obviously, those aren't real, but those are the mathematical endpoints. And in between 0 and 1, and I really want to stress this, there is no inherent meaning of a particular value. You really have to compare different economies in order to get a sense of what economic inequality, as seen through the Gini coefficient, actually means. So let's go through some more of these details. The intuition I'll give you in a moment is from simple geometry. And the example is that we're going to we'll also see that we'll turn individual income deciles into a cumulative distribution to get a Gini coefficient. The basic math that you see here in the chart is just this. The Gini coefficient is the area A over A plus B. So this number can vary quite a bit, and we'll see that with our detailed examples shortly. Now remember, the Gini captures distribution. It doesn't tell you anything about absolute levels of wealth. That's pretty important. But let's go through that distributional piece and imagine how you come up with this. So imagine lining up everybody here on the horizontal axis from lowest income to highest income, and then stacking up the income on the vertical axis. So you have one person, the lowest income person and their income, the next lowest income and their income on top of that. And that goes all the way through until you have 100% of the people in the economy and 100% of the income. Now, you can see how you'd get that 45-degree line, right? Because if everybody had exactly the same income, you'd have a person and that income, and another person and the same income again. And it would just be a straight line all the way up. So that is the basic intuition, the geometric intuition for how you calculate the Gini coefficient. Now, let's imagine this with a slightly richer example. This is taken from the Wikipedia page on the Gini coefficient with the deciles of global income from 2011. And what you see there is the poorest to the wealthiest deciles, the poorest to the wealthiest categories of 10% ranked by income for the global economy. And you can just imagine how those first few deciles really don't have a lot of money, so they're pretty low. And then the last decile or two are loaded. And when you connect that with a curve, you get something that looks a little bit like the stylized example on the left, but is close to the real Gini, close to helping you calculate the real Gini coefficient for the global economy. All right, that's how the basic Gini coefficient works. Now, we're going to dive in and look at a number of these examples from a whole bunch of different countries, but we have to do one more thing to pile onto the Gini coefficient and think about it kind of before and after we make a bunch of changes via policy. Let's do that next. So I'm going to refer to the terms pre-distribution and redistribution. Redistribution you've probably heard, that's pretty common, but pre-distribution comes from a reading I'll take a look at in part 2 of this 3-part series. So let's begin here. I think this is the most important filter. You want to think about before and after interventions in the marketplace. You can have very different pre-distribution starting points. That's the extent to which there's inequality in the outcomes generated by the market in different places. And then you also have different redistribution efforts and results. That's really after the market has done its work. Now, what do I mean really by pre-distribution and redistribution? Let's go through the examples, because even if these terms aren't familiar, I'm sure the examples of the interventions will be. So, mechanisms that can produce pre-distribution, in other words, more equal market outcomes. High minimum wages are probably the easiest example to understand. That's before the market can even do its thing. That's the ground rules, right? That you have to pay people a certain amount. If you have higher minimum wages, you will have more equal outcomes from the market doing what it does. Next, think more broadly beyond wages to stronger protections for labor or more bargaining power for labor vis-a-vis employers. Clearly, having that additional power and strength vis-a-vis employers will lead labor to get a larger share of income. And finally, I'd ask you to think about financial market protections for people who hold debt vis-a-vis creditors to be another way that the pre-distribution outcome can be more equal. That's an interesting idea, and it may not be obvious, but there are many ways in which we can protect people in financial markets and allow markets to do a better job for them. Next, think about mechanisms that can produce redistribution, and these will probably be more familiar, but those are going to take whatever the market does and lead to a more equal final outcome in these cases. So income and payroll taxes are probably the easiest ones because you probably paid all of those already. Estate taxes or other taxes on wealth would be another form of redistribution, again, after the market has done what it does. And then from a policy standpoint, perhaps the biggest category of interventions are what we call transfer payments. If you don't know that term, a more technical term from economics, you certainly know Social Security, welfare, food stamps, college loans that are based on need. Federal disability support is an important one. More than 10 million people in the United States get some form of that. Those all take the market outcome and then move money around again to get different final outcomes. All right, so those are pre-distribution and redistribution impacts, and we're going to look at the Gini coefficients in both of those cases. So one thing to know as we head into looking at the graph, a lot of heterogeneity here. That actually makes it very interesting to look across countries. And when I say heterogeneity, I mean both in pre-distribution and redistribution outcomes, though it's that final redistribution one we're going to be most interested in. And again, not in the analysis, not on the graph. Absolute per capita income is missing here. But also non-financial safety net elements, things like the provision of health insurance or health care to a population. Those things don't really occur here. You could weave them into the Gini, but we won't do that work right now. And finally, there are lots of other important things that may have some link over time to the way resources are distributed in the society that matter a lot, but we're not looking at those explicitly right now either. I think life expectancy is one of the best ones to consider. All right, let's dive in and look at these different Gini coefficients. This shows a wide range of, for the most part, developed economies with their pre-distribution and redistribution impacts. This says just before and after redistribution, but I do think it's important to say that there are policy influences that help generate the starting point. So let me walk through exactly what you're looking at. On the right side of each horizontal bar, we have the pre-distribution Gini coefficient. So that's what you get out of the market as it is allowed to function, though, again, there are some policy interventions baked in there. And on the left-hand side, the left end of each horizontal bar, you have the result after redistribution. And that's how the graph is ordered, which makes sense because that's what people generally care most about. Look, how much they end up with after all of the effects of policy. Now, a few points. You'll notice that despite differences, all of these countries do something to redistribute income. That's worth noting. And we won't go over every single one of these, but let's go over a couple of pairs of them that I think make a few points. First of all, let's look at the US and Finland. These two economies end up in very, very different places. The lived experience of economic equality or inequality are completely different in these two places. Finland is much, much more egalitarian, and you can see this from a much lower Gini coefficient. That's going to fit with most of the things we know. In many ways, Finland is a very characteristic Nordic economy or Scandinavian economy. But what's interesting is that if you look on the graph and their starting point, both of them start from fairly unequal places, two of the most unequal starting points on the graph. It's just that the decisions to intervene in the market subsequently and to redistribute post-market are quite different in the two countries. Next, let's glance at two major economies that end up in the same place, but appear to start in very different places in a pre-distribution sense. Here we have South Korea and Germany. So South Korea and Germany are almost indistinguishable in terms of the final outcome after redistribution. But the things that they are doing in their labor markets and in other ways to affect pre-distribution are obviously quite different. Now, I'm not here to say that any one of these is better or worse. I do think it's interesting to note the magnitude of the change as the extent to which taxes are marshaled to help the lowest income members of society. But really, the main thing here is to see how big the ranges are and how there are very different approaches. It's clear that some economies, South Korea is one example, Switzerland just a couple of rows below is another, where there's a lot done to change the way the market acts, and then just some redistribution after the fact. And then in other cases, there's clearly a lot less affecting the market in a raw sense, and then there's a lot more redistribution after the fact. Those are quite profound policy differences. The main point I want to make is that these are choices that the society makes. There's a big difference in outcomes here, but there are a lot of tools in these toolboxes in a pre-distributive or redistributive sense to get where you want to go if, in fact, you want to end up with a more or less equal distribution of wealth and income. All right, enough on the Gini coefficient. Let's tack on a few other points. So I signaled before that there are some other terms and other metrics out there. There are many other indicators. I just wanted to call out one more to pile on to life expectancy from earlier, and that is the child poverty rate. I think sometimes we can look at distributions of wealth and income and forget about people's life stages and their opportunities and where they are, in the trajectory of their lives. And there's a big difference across developed countries in terms of the extent to which there are children living in poverty. A good one to consider. Also, there have been really big changes globally over time, as I hinted at before and I mentioned with China. It's worth taking a look at these graphs to think about how the global economy has grown, but also shifted in very interesting ways over the long haul. All right, enough slicing and dicing for now. Let's do these two last pieces. They're fun. CEO pay as an indicator, I think, is immediately appealing because it's fun just to focus on something that we can relate to a little bit more than an economy as a whole, and rather, one person's salary, even if it's a little bit more than salaries we personally have seen. This is a typical article out of Forbes from a couple of years ago. CEO pay skyrockets to now hundreds of times that of the average worker. The interesting comparison point is there in the first paragraph. In the 1950s, a typical CEO made 20 times the salary of his or her average worker. Obviously, things have changed a lot. Now, this sort of reporting has become increasingly common over the last couple of decades as that ratio has risen. I want to make a few specific points. CEO pay is a compelling measure, especially compared to average worker pay, and I think you should pay attention to it as an absolute measure and a relative measure. I think it's worth actually looking at the levels of CEO pay occasionally, and I have a link there from the Economic Policy Institute if you'd like to. Also, I think it's a reasonable measure of some aspects of inequality, but by itself, it's definitely an incomplete picture, so I am definitely not suggesting to use it in isolation. It is surely related not just to the inequality of income at a moment in time, but to the inequality of wealth over time. there are now quite a few people who are making $10 million or $20 million in a year, but most of those people are not spending $10 or $20 million in a year. So this is obviously income as a source of quite rapid wealth accumulation. And in fact, that's what we've seen empirically. So there's clearly a connection there between income and wealth. And last, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that CEO compensation is often described as a challenge related to corporate governance, largely or maybe entirely separate from questions of inequality per se. My advice, again, consider this one valid indicator, but don't use it alone. All right, so our final indicator we'll take a look at is the share of total income going to the top 1%. This shows how that number has evolved in a number of economies globally over the last century or so. The fluctuations and the jaggedness of these lines do tell us that this metric is volatile, but it's worth looking for trends, and sure enough, we can find them. In some economies, not all, but some, we have rapidly rising, in fact, rising to sort of historic, at least recent historic highs, inequality in the sense of the share of total income going to the top 1%. And the United States is leading the pack there. Interestingly, we have a handful of other major economies where the top 1% still have a large share of national income, but it has not risen over that last couple of generations the way it has in the United States and Canada and a few other places. I think this is an important one to look at because often it relates to how people feel that the economy is or isn't delivering for them over time. What we have seen in the United States in particular is not just that the top 1% are taking more and more of the share of income, but that a large percentage of economic growth is accruing solely to the top 1%. That's an interesting situation because it means that for many people in the economy, even when the economy is growing, there's a feeling of stagnation. And that adds a certain feeling of genuine inequality to it. There's more every year, but none of it's going to me, or maybe people like me, like in my half of the economy. That is definitely the feeling that people are left with when the share of total income going to the top 1% or 5% or 10% is most of economic growth. All right, that's it for this part. I will say this is just a snippet of all the material. For more information and for more details on the materials, go to joshuascove.info/inequality and take a look at parts 2 and 3 of this series.